Is anyone else cold? I don't know that we can do anything about that, but thank you all for coming and putting up with the cold air to be with us tonight. It's very nice to be back in Minneapolis, in particular at the Walker. And thanks to Evan for making the trip.
Pleasure to be here.
What I thought we would do is, what we decided we would do is that I'm going to talk a little bit about a kind of art background for the conversation. And hopefully set the stage a bit for Evan's discussion about his time on the run last year, which I guess was, almost a year ago?
Almost a year ago. I started in August.
And so I'll talk a little bit about the show. I'll assume that, how many people here have seen the show? Okay, so some people, all right. I'll assume that most people haven't in any case, but let me see if this is working. It is working, okay. So I thought I'd start with this slide as a way to just introduce the conversation, which is a work that's not actually in the exhibition, which is a piece by a German painter named Gerhard Richter titled Betty. And what's interesting to me about the piece is that it's a kind of counter-portrait, right? We normally think of portraits as providing a particularly intimate likeness of the subject, but in this case, the subject is looking away from us. So it's sort of this paradoxical portrait, which I kind of like, sort of an anti-performance as a performance still. And I guess just to introduce the show somewhat, this is a piece that is in the show. This is a work by an Italian artist, no longer alive, named Piero Manzoni from 1961. A version of which is in the exhibition that you can interact with. It's meant to be, it's called the magic base for living sculpture. So the idea is that if you stand on this pedestal, you can become a work of art, which is kind of a nice idea, right? Around the same time, the artist was actually going around and signing people with a marker on the street and turning people into living sculptures that way. And then this is a piece from 1967 by an Argentinian artist named David Lamelas, which is just a simple theatrical spotlight in a darkened gallery that kind of demarcates the space almost into people who are watching or people who are putting themselves on view by stepping into the light. And so when I was thinking about the show, it sort of came out of both my interest in sort of these 1960s performative-based works that invite you to do something, particularly sort of putting yourself on view or placing yourself into a different context from just a watcher or a looker or a spectator. And I guess putting that into a context that was situated and informed by my interests in sort of a couple broader cultural things that for a while I thought had nothing to do with art in the back of my mind, one of which is sort of social media, which I have grave ambivalences about. I don't do Facebook or Twitter or really any of these things because they somehow make me very uncomfortable. But they're fascinating to me, sort of how they've achieved a kind of cultural prominence, and also the backlash against these things has been interesting to me. And at the same time, the continuing expanding governmental role in our private lives, which is kind of remarkably undiscussed, I think, and sort of unresisted. So now we're, I don't know how many years into knowing that the government can read our emails and listen to our phone calls without any additional permission needed. And that's sort of just a fact of life now of living in America. So all of these things sort of came together in my thinking about the show and made me think differently about these kinds of pieces. And so I was led sort of in thinking back to the Richter painting a little bit to a piece from the late 70s, early 80s by a very interesting artist, Taiwanese artist, who immigrated illegally to the United States named Tei-Ching Hsieh, who's most famous for having done a series of year-long endurance pieces. One where he tied himself to another artist for an entire year, another one where he lived in a cage for an entire year. Before he started any of these things, though, while he was working as an illegal laborer in New York City restaurants, he decided that he should actually, instead of being afraid that the government would find him, look at that differently and think that, well, actually there were a lot of people who wanted to find him, and in that sense he was very popular. And so he made a kind of flyer for himself with his fingerprints and the information from his passport. He didn't actually distribute it until a couple years later, when he was actually living outdoors on the street in New York for an entire year. And no one actually made the connection. And he's now a naturalized U.S. citizen. This is an interesting drawing by a Belgian artist who lives in Mexico City named Francis Alice, where he mapped out the path of least surveillance through the city of London. And so the sort of pen line that you see is Francis figuring out how to get through the most surveilled city on earth, relatively unseen. He calls this the clandestine way. Now, a piece that I do have in the show is this ski mask that is pictured here being worn by Chris Burden, who used it in a piece in the 1970s that was called "You'll Never See My Face in Kansas City," where he went to Kansas City to do a performance in a gallery and wore this the entire time he was in Kansas City. And this followed another early performance piece of his. He's best known for having had a friend shoot him in the arm with a .22 rifle, among a range of other masochistic performances from the 70s. But one of his first performances was actually to disappear for 3 days, which I also think is kind of interesting. And so the relic of that's in the exhibition is just an empty vitrine with a little card describing what he did. Another artist not in the show named Lee Lozano actually sort of removed herself from the art world as an artwork, as a performance. And this is a note from a predecessor to that piece called the General Strike piece, where she describes and records the last time she visits a museum, a gallery, and sort of documents all of that as part of the work itself. Eventually she actually dropped out entirely. The piece was called Dropout Piece. And this is 1969. And eventually moved down to Texas, more or less disappeared, I think moved to Europe for about 10 years, eventually came back to Texas, had vanished from the art world, but also more or less from many of her friends, died and is buried in an unmarked grave in Texas. This is another one of Tei-Ching's pieces. This is more or less his last year-long piece, where he said he would do a one-year performance, very similar to Lee Lozano's, where he would not do art, not talk about art, not see art, not read about art, not go to a gallery, all of this for a one-year period. And when that finished, I'm sorry this slide is so bad, he did another one where he said, I, Tei-Ching Hsieh, have a 13 years plan. I will make art during this time, so this is a shift. But I will not show it publicly. This plan will begin on my 36th birthday, December 31st, 1986, and continue until my 49th birthday, December 31st, 1999. And when that was done, he made this flyer and sort of invited friends to a kind of opening, or I guess finishing party to celebrate the conclusion of this piece, at which time he declared that he was no longer an artist. And since that time, he's not made any more work. Interestingly, this piece, I like how it sort of uses the aesthetic of a kidnap ransom note. And he, interestingly, in an interview a couple years ago, did talk about the art that he made during that 13-year period, and it was rather oddly to try and disappear as a kind of secret performance. And he moved out to Seattle and I think worked in a fish cannery and tried to make his way to Alaska. Of course, Alaska being this great beacon of invisibility almost. It's where you go to kind of disappear and resist American culture in a certain way. This is an artist, a young Italian artist named Roberto Cuoghi, who tried to disappear into the persona of his father. He gained an enormous amount of weight, dressed like his father, adopted his mannerisms and way of speaking, and lived like this for 5 years, during which time his father died. And so he sort of lived on as this weird doppelganger of his dad. And then at a certain point decided that he needed to go back to being himself and actually had to have surgeries to kind of reclaim his old body, which I think is kind of fascinatingly odd. Other artists, an artist named Seth Price made an artist book actually culled from bits and pieces of the various kind of anarchist handbooks that exist with advice about how to disappear in America that have changed over time and sort of set the stage in part for Evan's piece and efforts. And I guess sort of thinking about Alaska again, I was reminded of the story of Christopher McCandless, who was pictured in the book and then the film made from it, Into the Wild, who moved to Alaska, ran away from his family, and essentially starved to death in the wilderness there. But this is the last photograph of him, which he took himself not long before he died. And I guess I'm sort of struck by how even at this great remove from society, there's still kind of an inability to resist the desire to be photographed, in a sense, to sort of put yourself in front of the camera, even as you're kind of checking out from the world. So I guess that sort of seemed like a natural way to introduce Evan's project. And with that, I turn it over to you.
All right. So as Sarah mentioned, I mean, what I was interested in doing, I started out because I was obsessed with people who fake their own death. And I had been collecting little stories of people who fake their deaths over the years, and I was trying to find out some way to do a longer story on one of these people. And I finally got Wired Magazine to agree to let me do a story, and it was centered around a guy from Arkansas who built up a lot of debt on his corporate credit card, and then he decided to fake drown himself and go start a new life. So it's sort of about how he got caught, and in the process of that, looking at all these other people who had gotten caught, and many of them are really kind of hilariously, bad at disappearing. And they always do something that in the end you say, I can't believe that they did that. I mean, there's one guy who, he lived in Indianapolis and he tried to fly a plane. He was going to jump out of the plane and it was going to crash in the Gulf of Mexico, and he was a pilot. And so he went through this whole process, he set it all up, and then he flew over Alabama. He radioed the tower just as he'd planned, said, my windshield exploded, I'm going to have to jump out of the plane. Or actually, he didn't say I'm going to have to jump out of the plane, he just said, my windshield exploded, I think I'm going down. And then he parachuted out of the plane, and unfortunately for him, they scrambled fighter jets to go examine this plane, which had stopped responding, and there was no one in it. And then he also had failed to put enough gas in the plane, so the plane actually crashed, not in the Gulf of Mexico, but in Florida, on the ground, and there was no body in it. But what interested me even more than that was that then they finally caught him, and he went to trial, and one of the things, he actually didn't go to trial, he had to plead guilty because one of the pieces of evidence they had against him was they had confiscated his laptop, and on his laptop were Google searches for how to jump out of a plane at X number of feet, Google searches for all of the places he had planned to go, for moving money into different bank accounts. So he had basically left a roadmap of everything that he wanted to do on his computer without even realizing that he'd done so.